Okay, recording in progress. Here we go. All right. Good morning, everybody. I have to apologize as well to those who are on Zoom. It's a new book, so I don't actually have the PDF yet. So unfortunately, those who are here in person have the book. Those who are on Zoom, it's going to have to be Torah Bal Peh. I'll try and read through the sources a little bit slower so that everybody can follow. I apologize. For those of you who have the book, we are beginning volume 16 of the Tzurba B'Rabbanan series. We did skip volume 15. The reason is because we are now beginning a set for the next 7 volumes over the course of the next 2 years. B'ezrat Hashem, we're going to be learning Hilchot Shabbat. From the beginning all the way through. We won't cover every single halakha in Hilchot Shabbat because there are many, but that's the idea, going through a Hilchot Shabbat. And the way we do it, we are beginning with the dinim, the laws related to Erev Shabbat, preparation for Shabbat, Halakat Nerot, Tefillot, a lot of the assays of Shabbat. Right? Everybody knows there are many things, 39 melachot, 39 categories of prohibitions which we cannot do on Shabbat, but of course there are many things that we can do and should do and must do to create the Shabbat atmosphere, so that's what we will be focusing on first. And the assays and mitzvot assay of Shabbat. Just a word of introduction in terms of the way the halachot are arranged. So the two of the earliest codes that we have in terms of the halachot, we have the Rambam in the Mishneh Torah, who was really revolutionary in the way that he took the halachot, rather than writing commentary to each Masechet of the Gemara as it appears, he reordered things in a new fashion. We then have the Tur as well, the son of the Rosh, as the Abba Turim, who also ordered things, one of the first of the codes, and the Shulchan Aruch is based on the order of the Tur. It's interesting, the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote, just to see the amount that he wrote a full commentary to the Tur, which is called the Beit Yosef, which became the basis for the Shulchan Aruch. He also wrote a commentary on the Rambam, which is called the Kesef Mishnah. And he writes that he thought about which work basing the Shulchan Aruch on. Had the Shulchan Aruch been based on the order of the Kesef Mishnah, it would be very interesting, would be very different. But the Rambam orders things in which is based on a conceptual fashion. When the Rambam starts talking about Hilchot Shabbat, he begins with the principles, he begins with the malachot, and he goes through it in that way. The Tur does it differently. The Tur orders things not conceptually, but chronologically. So he begins first with the halachot of Erev Shabbat, and then Friday nights, lighting candles, etc., and it goes through. That's the way the entire Tur is structured. That's the way the entire Shulchan Aruch is structured as well. If you look at Chelek Aleph, Shulchan Aruch begins Hashkamat Adam Baboker, when a person wakes up, Modeh Ani, Netilat Yadayim, going to Kriyat Shema, Tefillah, etc. So that's the order that we are following in Tzurba B'Rabbanan as well. We're in good company, following the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, going by the order of chronologically. So we begin on page 23 for those who have the book. Again, for those on Zoom, I do apologize for today is without the material in front of you. You'll just have to look at me. We begin with preparation for Shabbat, which begins well before Shabbat. As we know, today is Wednesday, Yom Revi'i B'Shavua. So we said this morning in the Shiur Shel Yom, every day, in fact, when we say the Shiur Shel Yom, we say Hayom Yom, Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, whatever it is, L'Shabbat. That is part of the mitzvah of remembering Zachoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kudsho. But on Wednesday this morning we said L'Chuna Ranana, which of course is part of Kabbalat Shabbat, and that is today we are 3 days before Shabbat. We begin to have, and this is a bona fide halachic obligation. There are certain halachic obligations which kick in terms of preparing for Shabbat. Now that we are within 3 days, and we'll see how this works. So the Gemara in the Masechet Shabbat, Daf Yutet, this is source number 1. For those who have the book, talks about certain things which one cannot do already 3 days before Shabbat. Right? Before 3 days, by the way, there is a machloket, what is considered 3 days before Shabbat. So we can't agree on anything. But when we say 3 days before Shabbat, is Shabbat included? So according to most of the commentaries, 3 days before means starting today, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is 3 days, and then Shabbat. The Vilna Gaon disagrees. He says the 3 days actually include Shabbat, so it would only kick in on Thursday. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Prior to that, a person's not required constantly to be thinking about Shabbat. On Sunday or Monday, a person doesn't have to have in mind what's going to be coming to Shabbat. But in any case, so the Gemara says in source number 1, it says, Tanu Rabbanan, En mafligin basfina, So one cannot set sail on a ship. This is a halacha which I think once upon a time may have been a lot more common. The truth is nowadays it still is common. If somebody goes on a cruise or something like that, we'll see as well how it relates to other forms of transportation, trains. In fact, the sugya has a lot of implications for autonomous cars as well, perhaps. We'll get to that. But the Gemara tells us 3 days before Shabbat, so one should not set out for sail on a ship. Now, what's interesting is that this halacha is clear. It's in the Shulchan Aruch, it's in the Gemara, it's going to be brought in the Shulchan Aruch, brought by all the Rishonim, the Achronim. The Gemara is explicit what the halacha is, but it does not give us a reason. And therefore, we have probably about 12 or 13 different reasons in the Rishonim. Don't worry, we won't go through all of them. But we have many different explanations in the Rishonim what the reason for this halacha is. Fascinating what we have here, this case where you have a halacha which is agreed by everybody, but nobody can agree what the reason is. So that will have implications. In any event, says the Gemara that so 3 days before Shabbat, you cannot embark on a ship. It says so first distinction, this is when it's regarding a voluntary matter. If it's for a mitzvah matter, this will have implications as well, then it would be permitted, even later on. The Gemara then says if you're going on the ship, you have to, if the captain of the ship is non-Jewish, you have to ask them, you have to say, when it comes to Shabbat, will you stop? So long as you've made that stipulation, even if he says yes, and then he doesn't stop, it's okay, but you told him what to do. But anyway, the distinction is between 3 days and not 3 days. The continuation of the Gemara. No, so we're going to talk about it. So that means you have to reach port, but the ship has to dock before Shabbat comes in. The truth is that nowadays it's possible. A ship can anchor in. Again, I'm not an expert in terms of what's that. Yeah. Seemingly, that's what you'd be required to do. Sorry, people can't hear the questions. I'll repeat the questions as we go on. But in any event, and the stipulation is wherever this person, you're going along on the river, sailing on the river, the sea, whatever it is, you say when it gets to Shabbat, you need to stop. You need to plan the journey in such a way that can stop the ship before Shabbat. He says yes. It gets to Shabbat and he carries on. You say, what are you doing? I said, I'm not stopping the journey. We have to keep going. Okay, you tried. You did it before 3 days, and that's okay. The Gemara here also mentions the case of laying siege to a city. Over here, it's talking about which is very relevant nowadays. It's talking about a milchemet reshut. And a milchemet reshut, I'm not going to go now into the distinctions of what's a milchemet reshut and what's a milchemet mitzvah, etc. But it says there that if one embarks on what's called a milchemet reshut, that should not be, you're going to siege a city, that should not be done within 3 days of Shabbat. Obviously, we're talking about milchemet mitzvah, we're talking about pikuach nefesh, we're talking about the situation, then it can be whenever, and that's permitted, and there are amazing footage that's coming out of Gaza of the soldiers, on Shabbat, and making kiddush, and making Abdallah, and all sorts of things going on there. But in any event, back to our topic. So in source number 2, the Shulchan Aruch brings us. He says, "Mutar laflig basfina afilu be'erev Shabbat im olech ledvar mitzvah." So if it is for a mitzvah need, you can go on the ship whenever it is, even on erev Shabbat. As we've said, you should stipulate with the captain to stop, and if he doesn't, okay, no problem. When it comes to a davar reshut, a voluntary matter, do not embark on this journey within 3 days, close to Shabbat. And again, the Rama says before 3 days is permitted. So now why? What is the reason? Why is it that before 3 days one can go on the ship, within 3 days one cannot go on the ship? The Mishnah Berurah over here has a long introduction. Mishnah Berurah does not so often give introductions, but sometimes where he feels it's necessary, he adds in and he explains some of the reasons brought by the Rishonim. He says, Yesh omrei matam. There are those who say the first reason. Shema yitztarech Yisrael la'asot melacha be'atzmo b'Shabbat mishum pikuach nefesh. Like once you're on the ship and you're in the middle of the ocean, the ship needs to be operated. If it doesn't, everybody will drown. So of course, in that situation, you can continue to operate the ship whether it's the non-Jewish sailor, the captain, or the person, the passenger who's on the ship himself. But the question is, are you allowed to put yourself in that situation in the first place? So that's the first understanding, that within 3 days, already now, I'm already thinking about Shabbat. I'll give you an analogy for this from Hilchot Pesach. By Hilchot Pesach, we say that within 30 days to Pesach, the person has to start being careful about different areas where they bring in crumbs, what they do, where they bring in chametz, etc. Now, in the Kislev, all right, we say no, nobody has to worry about where you bring chametz in your house or different things. Pesach's a long time away. When we get to Pesach, we'll deal with it. But within 30 days before, already now, you should be thinking about it, and you have some sort of obligation. Similar idea here. The beginning of the week, I don't need to be thinking about Shabbat. By the time I get to Wednesday, I should be thinking about Shabbat. And if I know that I'm going on the ship now, that means within 3 days, I will be in a situation. Then it will be pikuach nefesh, and those melachot will have to be done. That is, of course, then permitted. But may you put yourself in that situation in the first place? The answer here is no. That is explanation number one. There is a bit of a distinction between some understand that it's you yourself who will have to do the melacha. There are some who understand that it's the captain or the sailors on the ship who will have to do the melacha. Either way, that's still Amira Nochri, and that's still forbidden. So the question about putting yourself, that's one rationale for this. Yeah. Seemingly not. The question was, in the first two sources we saw, there was an idea that said meaning that you ask the non-Jewish captain to stop on Shabbat, and he says yes, and even though he doesn't, that's okay. If you ask him and he says no, well, that seems to be what the Gemara is implying, that's not right. But that's within 3 days. Before 3 days, you'd be permitted. Yeah. So that's explanation number one. Explanation number one is that you are putting yourself in a situation where you will have to be, you will have to do melacha, or melacha will have to be done on your behalf. Explanation number two, there's brought here regarding tchumen. We won't get into that now. Explanation number three, which is the rif, which this many later poskim understand that this is the primary reason why this is forbidden. It says here in the second paragraph of source number 3, a rif svirale. The Ikara Isum Mishum Bitum Mitzvat Oneg Shabbat. Amazing. He says, Oneg Shabbat, a person, you're going to go into the sea, you're going to go into a boat. He says, Kol Gimel Yamim Rishonim, Yesh Lem Tzar Mechamat Mianoah Hasfina. I think that boats have changed a little bit in the last few hundred years, but once upon a time, and it may still be the case, a person may get seasick. You go into the boat the first couple of days, it's shaking, it's going up and down on the waves, and whatever it is. Therefore, he says, you'll be dizzy, you'll feel sick, and therefore you won't be able to have Oneg Shabbat out of this. But if you've been on the ship for 3 days already, you've become accustomed to it, your body's is okay, is more comfortable, and therefore that would be permitted. We see from here how important Oneg Shabbat is. It's not just, people joke sometimes, Oneg Shabbat, okay, I'll have another cookie for dessert, whatever it is. No, Oneg Shabbat is a real concept, a real bona fide halachic requirement. And then there are other explanations brought here as well. Perhaps it's related to the idea of there is a gzeirah against building going into water, swimming in water. You may be in a situation, a life-saving situation where it's necessary to build a raft. And what's called Gzerat Shoshayatin, that may be related to this prohibition as well. Okay, so those are some of the reasons that are brought in terms of why one cannot go out onto the sea within the 3 days before Shabbat. Again, 3 days before it would be permitted. Source number 4 is a contemporary article called "Don't Miss the Boat" by Rabbi Tzvi Goldberg. So he summarizes how this is relevant today to cruise ships and the like. He says, Chazal decreed that it's forbidden to undertake a journey by sea within 3 days of Shabbat. Although the Rishonim don't agree on the reasoning, the primary concern is that a person may get seasick and be unable to enjoy Shabbat. Therefore, sailing 3 days before allows time for one to adjust to the motion of the sea. The concern may seem negligible today, but once Chazal established the decree, we have no right to abolish it. As we're coming up to this concept very soon. Moreover, some travelers don't get seasick on board cruise ships. Although ships may toss in the sea, the waves and constant motion often wreak havoc on one's equilibrium. I've never been on a cruise ship, so I don't know. But he says there are 2 lenient factors to keep in mind. First, as we already mentioned, that according to the Vilna Gaon, the 3 days actually begins from Thursday. So that would give us an extra day. The Wednesday would be permitted. He says, second, according to all opinions, one's permitted to embark any weekday if the ship docks before Shabbat and remains in port during Shabbat. So then there would be no problem there. There is another question which comes up: if the people that are running the ship are Jewish. All this we've spoken about until now is where the ship we have non-Jewish sailors. What if the people sailing the ship are Jewish? So Rav Moshe Feinstein says that there's no difference. It's the same thing, just as you can go before 3 days. He says that would be permitted. On the other hand, Rav Ovadia Yosef, as well as the Lubavitcher Rebbe, are very, very stringent, and they say no. They add in the fact as well that nowadays the ship could very, very easily dock on Shabbat, and therefore they don't see a leniency for this. So that is regarding cruise ships. Are you allowed to get off assuming a dock's on Shabbat? So now we get into a question of tchumen. This question, we'll see later on, this question comes up regarding an aeroplane as well. What happens if one was on a plane and it was delayed, and then obviously one should do one's utmost to avoid, more than one's utmost, but one should avoid being in such a situation. But sometimes extenuating circumstances happen. So then one would be required, strictly speaking, to stay on the plane. That wouldn't happen. They wouldn't really let you. And if they make you get off, you would then have to stay in the airport. So the same thing with the ship. You would have to stay there. If you can get off before Shabbat, that would be preferable. But if the ship is docked there, no. If you get off, if you're on the ship on Shabbat, so you should stay on the ship on Shabbat. What's interesting here as well is that this idea is not just related, we mentioned this 3 days. So we saw the Gemara mentioned it regarding a ship, it mentioned it regarding besieging of a city. Other questions that come up. So Hilchot Yosef in source number 8, for example, talks about if someone is having elective surgery. Obviously any type of surgery which is urgent, which is life-saving, or even not, which is urgent, can be done whenever it needs to be done. What about elective surgery? If one chooses to do that within 3 days close to Shabbat, and therefore, again, Halachot are going to have to be done. But if the surgery is done, you can do whatever needs to be done to take care of the patient. But should you go into that in the first place? It says Hilchot Yosef, Lefi Amor Yotzeh, Shemiyom Chamishi b'Shavua v'Eilach, from Thursday and onwards. I guess he's going like the graph, he says from Thursday. Asur la'asot ma'aseh, shekatotza'a mimenu yivatzer matzav shel pikuach nefesh. One is required, Abanisha, not to put oneself in a situation that will require melachot to be done for pikuach nefesh. V'yetzarech lechalel Shabbat. Lachen. By the way, the source of this in the Rishonim, and the Tashbetz talks about a case of a brit milah which has been delayed. There is a question. Once it's been delayed, should it be done within the 3 days of Shabbat? Because then you're going to have to do melacha, or heating water, etc. for the baby. Again, but the question is raised. So he says over here, says the Hilchot Yosef, Lemaisa nowadays the brit will be done whenever it can be. Obviously not on Shabbat. If it's postponed, if it's actually the 8th day, then it will be on Shabbat. He says, Lachen benituach she'eno dachuf, a non-urgent surgery. You're going to talk shkedim, tonsils, the example he brings, obviously in a non-life-threatening way. Yesh l'kovol l'tchilat hashavua. Ideally, it should be scheduled for the beginning of the week or earlier in the week. Shema yitztachu lechalel Shabbat l'shem tipul achar nituach. In order to avoid chilul Shabbat, which may have to take place afterwards. Now, he brings in all those that are lenient. There's another factor. Sometimes you have a doctor who performs the elective surgery who's only available on Thursday or Friday, so then that would be lenient as well. He says, of course, but if the surgery was done on Thursday or Friday and you need to perform malachot in order for pikuach nefesh, that would be permitted. Okay, the next question that comes up is: does this extend? What about other forms of transport? So maybe one of the earlier sources to talk about this, the Khatam Sofer. The Khatam Sofer, going back a couple hundred years, talks about trains. And he says, based on the Salacha that we have regarding, again, what's the case? Theoretically, you could ask, could a person be on a train, which they could be traveling on, maybe from before Shabbat or on Shabbat? It's being the one who is, obviously, if there is a Jewish driver who's performing Malacha, that's going to be clearly forbidden. But if it's a non-Jewish driver performing the Malacha and the train is driving anyway, they're not doing it for you, would it be permitted? So the Khatam Sofer is emphatic about this, that it is forbidden. He says over here, source number 9, this is the Piskei Tshuvot, which is a contemporary sefer quoting Khatam Sofer. It says, Binyan Nesiya b'Rakevet v'Chashmaliyot, trains and trolleys, Khatam Sofer oser, Shehare al hayabasha yesh isur tchumin. First of all, there's a question of tchumin. We didn't get into it. There's a big machloket. Does tchumin apply on the sea or not apply? But on land it would apply. You might say that above 10 tfachim there is no isur tchumin. Nonetheless, you're in this vehicle, there would be a prohibition. However, he says the main prohibition over the page 30, he says, or the gufo mitnadned b'nesiyah. Again, I think ships have changed. I think trains have changed as well since the days of the Khatam Sofer. But certainly in those days, he says your whole body is shaking throughout the journey. Umikre bitul onek Shabbat. There is a complete nullification here of onek Shabbat. And he therefore says it would be forbidden even within the tchum, even within the city. So is it just the case of onek Shabbat? Or is there something else? The truth is the Khatam Sofer actually, it's a shame we don't have the full quote, but he relies quite heavily on the Ramban. The Ramban ala Torah, Ramban in his commentary on the Torah gives us there are a lot of halachic principles which emerge from those commentaries as well. And he gives us a principle which is very, very relevant for this question, very relevant for many of the modern questions of technology and Shabbat we've spoken about in the past. Let me read it to you, source number 10. He says, the Ramban learns as follows. Niresh ha-midrash hazeh lomar, shenitztavenu min ha-Torah liot lanu menucha b'yom tov, afilu midvarim she'enan melacha. Again, that we should have menucha on I guess here's talking about Yom Tov, it applies to Shabbat as well. This is the Ramban in Parshat Emor. He writes similar idea in Parshat Kedoshim, a few different places. But he says, from the fact that essentially Shabbat, this is not does not appear in the text, but from the fact that Shabbat is called Shabbaton, says the Ramban, as we said in the introduction, we're now learning about the positive aspects of Shabbat. There are the negative aspects. There are the melachot. There are the 39 categories of labor which one may not perform on Shabbat. However, there is more to that. There is a positive atmosphere of Shabbat which needs to be created. And the Ramban understands that a person could, strictly speaking, not transgress any one of those 39 melachot. None of those 39 specific prohibitions. However, if you create an environment and you create an atmosphere which is not Shabbat, then on a biblical level, you have violated Shabbat. You have not kept Shabbat. The million-dollar question is, how do we know and who defines what is that environment and what does it mean? For that, we look to the Rishonim, to the Achonim, to the Geleitor throughout the ages. And these are things which, to a certain extent, may be subjective depending on the generation. You know, when the time switch was first invented, on Shabbat, right? Which home in Israel, which Jewish home that keeps Shabbat does not use at least 1, 2, 3, 4 time switches every Shabbat? When they were first invented, Rav Moshe Feinstein said, no, this is going to be a bitur of Shabbat, this should be forbidden. Okay. His opinion there was not accepted. So some of these things may change, but everybody agrees that this atmosphere of Shabbat, you know, sometimes you hear people say, oh, it's not Shabbos day. It's not in the spirit of Shabbat, whatever it is. It sounds very fluffy. It's not fluffy. It's a bona fide halachic concept. So says the Ramban over here, he gives an example, the second paragraph. He says, yeah, shuk malei lako mekach umemka, תהיה החנות פתוחה, והכין בנים מקיף, השולחנים על שולחנם, והזהובים לפניהם, ויהיו פועלים משכימים למלאכתן, ומשכילים לעצמן כחול. He says, you could have a situation, theoretically, where you've not transgressed a single malacha of Shabbat. You have not transgressed a single thing d'oraita. The shuk will be open, everybody will be sitting in their shops, Everybody will be doing business. You won't handle money. You'll take whatever it is. Everybody's doing all this labor. Not a single melacha has been transgressed, but it's clearly not Shabbat. And that is a transgression of Shabbat on a biblical level, says the Rambam. Right. David said when Ezra, in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah came back, that's also the Gzerot of Muktzeh, etc. Many of them date back to that time as well. Correct. So he says, in this way, says the Ramban in bold, he says, "Vahen hutru hayamim hatovim ha'elu, ve'afilu ha'Shabbat atzma, shebechlal ze en be'em mishum melacha." He says, you will have a situation where Shabbat and Yom Tov there is no melacha mitzvah. Lachen amra Torah Shabbaton. That's why the Torah calls it Shabbaton, a day of rest. Right? In modern Hebrew, a Shabbaton is a public holiday. We don't really have them in this country, so I don't know what that means. But it's a Yom Shabbaton. You have one once every 4 years when there's an election. Maybe that's why we have them more often. But anyway, so he says, Lachen amra Torah Shabbaton. Shvita, right? Sheyeh Yom Shvita u'menucha lo Yom Torah. That it should be a day of rest, right? Shvita in the biblical sense, not in the modern sense. A day of rest and not a day of toil. So the Khatam Sofer applies this concept of the Ramban. Now we do have the Khatam Sofer in source number 11. He says the same thing. He says those people that are that are traveling on these wagons and on these trains, etc. This would fit into it's a bitul of Oneg Shabbat. And even if today you'll say it's not a bitul of Oneg Shabbat because it's very comfortable and the air conditioning and everything inside. Nonetheless, this fits into what the Ramban is saying, and this is not appropriate. So says the Tzitz Eliezer, source number 12. If that is what the Khatam Sofer said regarding trains, all the more so about aeroplanes as well. It says in Kach B'Rakevet, Alachat Kama B'Kama Nesya B'Aviron, She'aleh Shamayim Ve'Yaled To'omot Shviv Shviv Yitaleh. I think by an airplane, even if you have the best airline and the most experienced pilot, you have turbulence now and again, and the plane goes up and comes down, and you do have, this is definitely an issue. Because that would be forbidden. Okay. So that's in terms of different forms of transportation on Shabbat. As I alluded to at the beginning, this also will be the source of a sugya which is becoming more and more relevant. It's not quite practical yet, but the question of autonomous cars. I'm not going to go into in depth, but I remember a few years ago, somebody wrote an article in one of the Torah journals about the potential possibility of permissibility of using autonomous vehicles on Shabbat. Again, it's not a practical question now. But Rav Yaakov Ariel, in fact, wrote a response, and he was very, very upset about this. And he said this should not be. It's clear that it's forbidden, and it shouldn't even be discussed. And it's obvious this is not appropriate. I think right now it is obvious that it's not appropriate. And if tomorrow somebody was going to market an autonomous car, it would be clear that would be forbidden on Shabbat. But it is something which will need to be discussed as it becomes more and more prevalent. And it may be certainly for, if you think about medical personnel and security personnel who need to travel on Shabbat, already nowadays, many poskim say that an electric car, one that you drive yourself, but an electric car, as opposed to one which is burning fuel, that is for medical personnel, etc. When there's a clear case of pikuach nefesh and the person is driving to the hospital, so then there's no issue. But we have certain borderline cases as well, maybe driving back, things like that. And many poskim, I think all poskim would agree that using an electric car is better because that is probably an isur d'Rabbanan as opposed to an isur d'Oraita when you're driving it. But certainly it's a less, when you're driving an ordinary car, not electric, and you're burning fuel every time you press on the gas, that is certainly an isur d'Oraita of Mavir. So in the same way that an electric car would be better, surely an autonomous car would be better for that. Does that mean that it would be completely permitted for anybody to use? So again, based on the sources that we've seen, it would seem to fit into that category as well. At least at the moment, if it was something that 100 years down the road or 200 years down the road, where it's something which is very, very commonplace all the time, that may be something that the poskim then will have to discuss. But so there you can see on page 33, again, there's a summary, just more or less to summarize what we've seen. We said that from 3 days coming up to Shabbat, that already we have the obligation in terms of being careful. We're not talking yet about preparing for Shabbat in terms of Kavod Shabbat, Oneg Shabbat. We'll get to that next. But in terms of avoiding Melachot, or avoiding being in a situation where one would have to avoid perform Melachot, so that from Wednesday, according to most poskim, Thursday, according to the Gra, that is when one needs to take that into consideration. That is why, according to many, one cannot go on the Shabbat. Others say it's because of the idea of Oneg Shabbat, and that if you have been on the ship for more than 3 days, your body is used to it, and that would be permitted. We looked at the application of that regarding cruises, regarding elective medical procedures, as well as other forms of transportation, which based on the Khatam Sofer and the Ramban, we see would also be forbidden on Shabbat under normal circumstances. Okay, so that is topic number one. Topic number two, let's get now into more of the positive aspects of preparing for Shabbat. And so when we ask the question, when does one have to begin preparing for Shabbat? So some people will say, an hour before. Some people will say on Friday morning. Some people will say on Thursday. Really? The answer is all the time. All the time. So you have a look at page 34. The Mechilta tells us, this we mentioned already earlier, but the Mechilta in source number 15, Elazar ben Chananya ben Chizkiah ben Hanania ben Gurion Omer, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. We know that in the Aseret HaDibrot, which were given, are written in two different places in the Torah. In one place it says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. In one place it says Shamor. But Zachor relates to the positive aspects, remembering in a positive way. Shamor relates to negative aspects, guarding Shabbat, not to transgress. As we say every Friday night in the Chadadi, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. Right, when those commands were given, so Hakadosh Baruch Hu said both Shamor and Zachor at the same time, as the Gemara says, it's something which is impossible. Try it, I'm sure you've all tried it. You can't say two words at the same time, but there we go. But so both are included. But he says here in the Mechilta, what does it mean Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho? Tehei Zachor me'echad b'Shabbat. One of the differences is you can remember Shabbat to guard Shabbat in the sense of not doing melacha. That applies on Shabbat itself. Remembering Shabbat in order to honor it applies on Shabbat and applies throughout the week. Right now in the Shiur, by learning Hilchot Shabbat and remembering, we are putting the mitzvah Zachor Yom HaShabbat. Right? There are sometimes you get those. I don't know if you've ever seen those notes they have in some places where they do a calculation of how many mitzvot you get with each word of Limud Torah. So every time you learn each word, Talmud Torah is parallel to all 613 mitzvot, and therefore every word is 613, and multiply that by the fact that if we're learning on Shabbat, if we're learning about Shabbat, so it's Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, so add another mitzvah for that. To do it on Shabbat, you add a mitzvah on Shabbat. Okay, lots of mitzvot we can rack up while we're learning. But Hayom Yom Shabbat, exactly. So that's what it says here in the Mechilta. It says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho, Zachor me'echad b'Shabbat. Remember it already from the beginning of the week. So one way that we do that is by saying Hayom Yom Rishon b'Shabbat, Hayom Yom Sheni b'Shabbat. We count the days of the week according to Shabbat in order to remember Shabbat. By the way, we're meant to do this with the months as well. That's why it says by the Chodesh Nisan. It says Rishon Lachem Chodesh Hazeh Rosh Chodashim Rishon Hu Lachem LeChodshei Hashana. Says the Torah, when you count the months, so you count Nisan is the first month, and you remember all the other months. We count them to Nisan. That's why only the Jewish people can begin the year in the 7th month, right? With Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah is actually the 7th month because we count the months to Nisan. And as a result of that, there's a question. I think we discussed this once in Subam Rabbanan. If one uses secular dates, is it better to use the names of the months, or is it better to use the numbers of the months? That's so clear. So there are poskim who say, now you might hear people, if you talk in Hebrew, so you say, what's the, Rishon HaShvi'i, or whatever it is, relating to July, should you be using those numbers? Perhaps not, because when we count the months, we count according to Nisan. That should be the way that we count numbers of months. Okay, but that's a topic for another time. That is in volume 1. I refer you back to that Shiur. If you missed it, you can find it on YouTube. But in any event, regarding selecting Shabbat. So one way of remembering Shabbat is that we count to Shabbat. But also, says here in the Mechilta, it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho, Tezochro me'echad b'Shabbat, she'im yitmaneh lecha mana yafa, te'eh metakno l'shem Shabbat. If you should come across a nice portion of food, already from the beginning of the week, you should set it aside for Shabbat. And we have to remember, when we learn these sources, that once upon a time, shopping was not like it is today. You can walk into the supermarket on any given day, on any day of the week, right? Not on Shabbat because it's closed and you're not allowed to go, so don't do that. But any other day of the week, you can go, you can find whatever you want. You can go to the shop, you go to the supermarket, the butcher, wherever. It's always available. Okay? In recent weeks, we had this experience. We had it during COVID. I think we had it at the beginning of the war as well. We walk into the shop and the shelves are empty, and there was a bit of panic going on. But once upon a time, it wasn't like that. There was whatever we've heard many times from Rabbi Wine stories in the previous generation, not going back centuries. But when there was one animal, and that was all that the town had to eat for the week, and the shochet and the rab would stay up the whole night in order to make so that it shouldn't be a treifa. Otherwise, nobody would have any meat, right? So it wasn't so simple. So you have this. Maybe some weeks you won't have meat, and maybe you'll have this piece. You won't have that piece. Whatever it is, that's how it was once upon a time. So in that reality, you get a good piece of meat which comes along once every month or whatever it may be. Okay, you set it aside for Shabbat. Nowadays, the question is, do we have to say to the same extent, we want a good piece of meat, we can go to the butcher whenever we want, we go to the shop whenever we want, or we required each time to set it aside? We'll see. But the truth is that there is a machloket regarding this. Famous machloket regarding between Hillel and Shammai. It's again in Gemara Masechet Beitza. Daf Tet Zayin. So it's going to be a while till we get there in the Gemara. But the Gemara says like this: Tanya, Amru alav Shammai Azaken. Kol yamav haya ochel likvod Shabbat. So Shammai would always eat in honor of Shabbat. How? Matzah beiman ha'ah. He found a good piece of meat, found a choice animal. He would say, Omer Zola Shabbat. That he would set it aside for Shabbat. That was the midah of Shammai. So he found a good piece on Sunday. He set it aside for Shabbat. Comes Tuesday, he finds a better piece. He says, okay, the piece that I kept on Sunday, I can eat today, and then I'll keep for Shabbat. That was Shammai. But Hillel Azaken, Hillel had a different quality. Midah acheret hayta. Shekol ma'asav l'shem shamayim, shene'emar Baruch Hashem yom yom. Hillel would say, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. There's a wonderful piece that came today. Baruch Hashem, Hashem will provide something even nicer for Shabbat. So he would. That was the way of Hillel. And normally we follow Hillel and Beit Hillel. But here you see, listen to what the Mishnah Berurah says in source number 17. He says, "Eskimu הרבה poskim shegam Hillel modeh shekdivrei Beit Shammai adif atzvei." He says, in fact, Hillel agrees that the way of Shammai, setting aside the better piece for Shabbat, is correct. He says, this is Mishnah Berurah. He says, Hillel, on his level of his madrega, of emunah, he had faith that Hashem will provide the right thing at the right time. Therefore, I'll have it. But the ordinary way of the world is not necessarily so. He says, "Potech b'Hashem shevadai is minul Shabbat manay yafa misha yamin. Uchdei lechazek midat bitchono haya nohel ken." Hillel would act in this way in order to strengthen the quality of bitachon. Aval b'shal kol adam, but for mere mortals, she'en bitchono chazak kolka, whose bitachon is not absolutely certain that this piece will come along in time for Shabbat. Then gam hu moded Shammai adif atzvei. He also agrees with Shammai. Upshita b'davar she'eno shachiach liknot. He says it's clear, says the Mishnah Berurah, that something which is not commonly available, something is not commonly available. You go to Osharad and they have this whatever steak it is that hasn't been there for 3 weeks. Okay, you take that, you say we'll keep this for Shabbat. Yeah, you can put it in the freezer. That's right. So says the Pnei Halacha, just to summarize this, source number 18. He says, bottom line, in our days, we've seen the machloket Hillel and Shammai. He says, nowadays, most of the time, this thing is somewhat irrelevant. Because most of the time, everything is very readily available. However, again, that's talking about ordinary things, ordinary foods which are readily available. You don't have to worry on Wednesday that you won't have it for Shabbat. Practically speaking, what comes out of this? When you plan your menu for the week, you should plan for Shabbat to be the most to be the choicest foods, which I think most people do. Yeah, but it's not a case of waiting on the lottery, going and waking up on Wednesday and wondering if something might come up. We might chance upon good food for Shabbat. We know it's there, we know it's available, but we should plan it. That's what we have for Shabbat. Okay, that is in terms of buying food and preparing. One of the takanot, one of the specific practices which we mentioned Ezra Sofer beforehand. So Ezra instituted a number of practices in the Gemara and Bava Kama. One of them is that one should do laundry before Shabbat. Again, we have to get into the mindset of Chazal whenever we learn about these halachot. Talk about laundry comes up very, very often in halachah. Comes up in Hilchot Shabbat, in Hilchot Kol HaMoed, regarding the 9 days, etc. I think two things that we have to bear in mind. One is, nowadays everybody has a cupboard full of clothes. You change your clothes every day. Baruch Hashem, standards of hygiene have changed since the days of the Gemara as well. In the days of the Gemara, a person had maybe one item of clothing, maybe 2 items of clothing. That was it. That was all that they had. So we're talking about laundry. It's not something that was done commonplace, that was done every day. It was something unusual. Also, it was very, very time consuming. It was nowadays, it can be time consuming, but it doesn't have to be. You put something inside the washing machine, you put in the powder, whatever, press the button and it's done. Again, not that long ago, that was unthinkable. So this is obviously going to make a difference when we talk about doing laundry before Erev Shabbat, because it's a very time-consuming activity. Okay, nowadays you have to put it in the basket, you have to take it out, you have to fold it out, but it's not. We cannot compare it to what was going on in the days of the Gemara. So says the Gemara in Bava Kama, Asarat Takanot Tiken Ezra. So it's number 19 for those who have the books. Asarat Takanot Tiken Ezra, Shekorim b'mincha b'Shabbat, Korim b'Sheni b'Chamishi. So some of them are related to the reading of the Torah, and one of them is Mechapsim b'Chamishi b'Shabbat. One of the takanot that Ezra made was that to launder one's clothing on Chamishi b'Shabbat, on Thursday, not on Erev Shabbat. We'll see later on, again, the poskim talk about that many of the preparations for Shabbat, it is better to do on Erev Shabbat. It's better to do them on Friday. Why? Because that is more recognizable that it's being done for the honor of Shabbat. Obviously, if one's not going to have enough time, or doing it on Friday is going to cause untold stress, and if then one can do it before, so then that would be. But over here, it says in the first place that regarding laundry, not to do on Friday, to do it on Thursday. Rashi says, Mechapsim bigdehem lechvod Shabbat. There's laundry of clothing in honor of Shabbat. And it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch. It says, Mitakanat Ezra, sheyu mechapsim begadim b'chamishi b'Shabbat and kvod Shabbat. Shulchan Aruch says, Ezra established one should wash one's clothes on Thursday in honor of Shabbat. And again, the question is, what is the main part of the takana? Is the takana to say that one should wash one's clothes on Thursday, specifically not on Friday? In other words, to take away from in order not to take away from other activities on Erev Shabbat, not to be engaged in this? Or is he saying to be on Thursday, it should be done in honor that one should wash one's clothes in honor of Shabbat? Okay, maybe the nafkamina between them is nowadays, what do you say, should one do laundry on Friday and Friday morning on Shabbat? So it says in Mishnah Berurah, source number 22, he says, Shabbat. In other words, one should do the laundry earlier on Thursday so that it should be ready for Shabbat. Erev Shabbat, not on Friday. So that on Friday one should be free to occupy themselves with preparations for Shabbat. Again, this is Mishnah Berurah, who's writing not that long ago, 120 years ago or so, says that one should be careful one should have a freshly laundered garment for Shabbat. The Shmirat Shabbat Hilchot, source number 24, one on page 37, says, Yesh la'ayem. In Takanat Ezra noeget kamayom. He says, does the Takanat of Ezra apply nowadays? Shekulam mechapsim b'mechonat kvisa. We have washing machines. The enach so sheyu trudim be'erev Shabbat, and we don't have to be so concerned that there won't be time to do the washing on Friday. V'lo shayach kan omar deva'inan gadol b'chokma b'inyan levater Takanat Ezra. This is not a case like where we said previously regarding the ship, for example. that where we have a takana of Chazal, we can't now go and undo the takana. Over here, this was an enactment made by Azal. He gave us a specific reason for it. Right? And the reason was that if you're going to go out to the river on Friday and you're going to do all your laundry, then you won't have time to prepare foods and you won't be able to be engaged in the Shabbat preparations. So over here, says the Shema Shabbat, im batel atam gam hagzera b'tela. In such a case, when the reason no longer applies, seemingly this does not apply as well. And therefore, the bottom line is that most of the poskim will say, Hilchot olam, which is Rav Ovadia as well, says Hayom shemachabsim b'mechonat kvisa chashmalit ve'en tzorich lebazvez הרבה זמן לכיבוס הבגדים ושמותר לכבש לעוד שבת. So nowadays it would be permitted to wash on Erev Shabbat mikol makom. Nonetheless, nachon nakdim, it's appropriate to do it earlier. And again, with many of these things, that at the end of the day, a little bit of common sense will not hurt. I.e., one should plan. The principle behind all of it is that one should plan appropriately for Shabbat so that one has enough time and is able to get all the preparations done. I just want to finish off. There's more to talk about here, which we'll carry on next week, in terms of some of the preparations and shopping and cooking and how important, it was next week as well, how important it is that one personally prepares for Shabbat. There are stories of the Amoraim in the Gemara talking about how they would engage in certain, maybe even physical activities in order to prepare for Shabbat. That is the honor of Shabbat. A person should not say it's beneath my kavod to go out and chop the wood or whatever it is, take out the garbage, for Shabbat. No, the honor of Shabbat is that you are engaged in that, and that's what the Gemara says. Mitzvah bo yoter bishlucho. Interesting, that principle, by the way. We know that we have certain mitzvot. You can have a shaliach, you can have an agent perform on your behalf. But we say a principle of mitzvah bo yoter bishlucho, that it is a greater mitzvah for one to be engaged in the mitzvah themselves rather than pass it on to a shaliach. We only find that listed explicitly in the context of two mitzvot: the mitzvah of kiddushin and the mitzvah of preparing for Shabbat. That's where it says mitzvah bo yoter bishlucho. But I just want to say something which does not appear in the Tzurba Rabbanan book, and this is in Rav Rimon's Sefer. He talks about in terms of the preparation. Another element here is there's a lot spoken about the physical preparation, about the technical preparation for Shabbat. This is all very important. There's also the spiritual preparation, and that is no less important. And some might even hazard to say that it is more important. For example, he brings out the Rambam. The Rambam writes the following. It says, Ezu kavod yoshev b'koved rosh me'achel akbalat pnei Shabbat. It says, what is kavod? That a person sits with a certain gravity, thinking about the fact that they are going to accept the Shabbat, just as one would greet a king. But the earlier sages would gather their students together on Erev Shabbat, and they would wrap in their clothes, and they would go and they would say, let us go out toward the Shabbat king or the Shabbat queen. That is the source of the Mechadodi as well. And it brings here, Ramon brings the Zohar that says that each individual gets a Neshama Yetera on Shabbat. There's an additional component, additional spiritual component to one's soul, which one is able to sense, one is able to feel on Shabbat. But that's quite well known. What's important then, the Zohar continues, it says, Kafum Dalga Dileh. It means every person according to their madrega, according to their level. What does it mean, their level? So he brings out the Ma'ol Bashemesh. Ma'ol Bashemesh is one of the Hasidic commentaries on the Chumash, and he says an amazing thing. He says, Yesh hashrat kedusha lekol adam b'Shabbat. Every individual receives a certain level of holiness, divine inspiration, I guess. But you should know it's not the same for every person. Yesh b'nei adam Hashem magishim yoter kedusha Shabbat. There are those people who feel the beauty and the sanctity and the holiness of Shabbat to a greater extent, and those who feel it to a lesser extent. Obviously, part of it is going to be to do with your environment and where you are. If you're in Beit Knesset Nasi, you will of course feel it to a great extent. If you're sitting somewhere else, or if you're sitting in a tank, it's a very different experience of Shabbat. The truth is, the Chayalim sitting in a tank may well feel the Shabbat to a very greater extent, but for other reasons. But But the person sitting by oneself, or the person sitting and singing Shmirot, etc. But it's not just about that. He says, Yesh Marbishim Yoter, Yesh Marbishim Pachot, like Ma'at Min Ma'at, Yesh Lem Arbek Dusham Meot. There are those who feel to a tiny extent, those feel to a greater extent. And he says, Akohu Lefi Hachanat B'nam. Everything is related to the effort that a person puts in, to the preparation that a person puts in. Asher Mechim Erev Shabbat LeShabbat. Chazal tell us, and they say regarding food, etc. This is used as an analogy for the world to come as well. If you prepare on Erev Shabbat, you'll get the benefit on Shabbat as well. But he says so too, the same thing here. He says that the extent that a person prepares from Erev Shabbat, says the Ma'or B'Shemesh, you've got to start, Erev Shabbat's already too late. You have to start preparing on Sunday, right? The whole week. So you come to your Tzurba Marabanan, maybe that's why we should move to Sunday. We'll start on Sunday learning about Hilchot Shabbat, and then we can then we'll really be prepared. Hashem right? He says Hashem Mamshich al Atzmo Kedushat Shabbat b'kol sheshet yemei ha'maaseh. Ukvi amshachato b'sheshet yemei ha'maaseh, to the extent to which a person prepares oneself and brings down the Kedusha throughout the week, so too to that extent in parallel. Kach margish Kedushat Shabbat b'Shabbatot. And he says, you can see this, it's tangible. It's not the same for each and every individual. The truth is, this idea of Hachana Ruchanet is brought in the Mishnah Berurah as well. Mishnah Berurah, which is not a Hasidic sefer, it's a halachic sefer. Mishnah Berurah writes, Siman Reish Nun, he says, Ra'oi b'chol yom shishi la'oher b'tshuva lepashpet b'masam. He says, every Erev Shabbat, a person should do a cheshbon nefesh. Person should think about one's actions, think about one's deeds, do some tshuva. He says, "She'en ra'oi lekabel et hamelech shel avush b'bluyei savot shel chalat avono." It's not appropriate to be full of sin in that way to be the king, and therefore he says a person should. I didn't check it out now. I think the Mishnah Berurah also writes that a person should spend a bit of time. Maybe he says every Shabbat or Mipam Lepam looking at Sifrei Musar. But that is certainly the Hachana Ruchanit, the spiritual preparation for Shabbat, for anything that we do, that is no less significant than the physical preparation of it. Okay, so Adkan, that's it for today. Next week, again, an announcement will come out regarding the days and when the Shiur will be, but we'll continue the first Shiur. So we still have to talk more about preparations of Shabbat, shopping for Shabbat, personally preparing for Shabbat, as we mentioned. There's also a long discussion about eating a meal on Friday. And if it's a meal which is larger than the meal one normally eats, what about a Sudat Mitzvah, come with the Brit Milah, Pidyon Haben, Purim, etc., and then performing Melachah and traveling on Friday. Okay, so those are all topics left in this week's Shiur. We'll continue next time. And then we'll move on. Coming on after that, we'll start getting into Hilchot Hadlakat Nerot, and moving on chronologically from there. Okay.